recording.
Excellent. Hi there. My name is Tostin. I'm from North Shield. I've lived in the middle when they still own North Shield and North Shield. So I haven't lived in a lot of other kingdoms. I've been lucky enough to be granted a laurel for my pottery, primarily, well, realistically for my cooking pots. My other wares, not as beautiful as so many other people make, but still are in good shape. My first event was in, and I cannot remember the AS for this, unfortunately, was in 1983. And I'm a reformed cook. I did one crown tourney feast. And then since then, that was the last crown tourney that Mid-Realm had in North Shield. And then I've done like one feast each, like every 20 years. So it keeps me back in the cooking side. I end up doing these cooking demos to help people figure out that cooking in clay is really a very simple process. It's all about heating slowly and controlling how it cools as well. Because thermal shock is what goes from a single part pot to a multi-part pot. And your goal is to not create a multi-part pot. Today, which is what I tend to use as my intro class, we're going to be making baked apples. And really making anything else is just an expansion off of these basic concepts. Let's see if the tripod will allow me to look at the apple, the pot. This might be a day for holding onto the camera as well. I was hoping that I wouldn't have to do that today. What I wouldn't give for an apprentice to be here and help me out. So what I'm going to do is peel the apples, because I like to get the peels off and the skins off. And I'm going to put them, and really, I will stop playing with the tripod as soon as I can figure out a way so that it doesn't tip over. Because I do need two hands to peel an apple. That's not going to work, is it? Oh, yes, it is. All right, pardon me. So we also don't need to necessarily learn how to peel apples. I end up quartering them, chopping them up. I leave them a bit on the rough side. Because I like my cooked apples a bit more rustic. I don't need applesauce. I will also use usually a mixture of apples, some tart and some sweet, reasonably as well. Very easy to use apples, pears, quinces, dried fruit tossed in, raisins, cherries, apricots. I've used peaches. Hi, I'm going to get rid of this idea of trying to have that at an angle, because we're going to be done with this part in just a second. And I'm going to toss in one sweeter apple along with the tart apples. When you're cooking in clay, reasonably what you're doing is, for the modern equivalent, cooking in a crock pot. It tends to be damp cooking. We also talked a little bit on Friday about the idea that it is possible to fry inside of clay, but it's more of an advanced skill set. And I would take my time working with wet cooking first. So I now have my apples chopped up. Pardon me. You'll notice that I've heaped up the apples a little bit because they're going to cook down. I'm also going to add some honey, and I've got some liquid here, and I'll put my lid on. I'm going to come over here to the fire pit, and people had asked about the fire pit. This is a nice size. It's about 18 inches across and 4 feet long. The 2x4s at the end are 8-foot 2x4s. And I have a pretty big mistake on here. I have one long rod and 2 shorter ones. I'm not always the most attentive of people when buying things. And I made a mistake of not getting them all the same size. Therefore, I'm supporting with 2 sawhorses at the ends. If you'll notice, our new pot is right over here. It's a ways away from the fire. We need to have a collection of fuel, and our cooking pots are then arranged around the fire. We start out a distance away, and every 5 minutes, we're going to give this a turn. Once it is hot, we're going to move the pot closer like this one is. And that's when it's warm to the touch. Going to give this one a turn. Ooh, that one's in good shape to now have, because I have, this is ours that we're doing for class, and I wanted to have things at different stages. So this one, we're going to move coals around the pot. And we're going to have those coals fairly evenly dispersed and a little ways away from the pot. Once the pot itself gets realistically so hot that you can't touch it, we can mound the coals right up against the pot and be able to boil to our heart's content. What we're trying to do is get the pot warmed up all the way around. So it's nice and even. And that is an amazingly hot fire today. We're going to give our pot a little turn. Of cooking in clay. We're going to come over here, have a seat, and chat a little bit. Because we need to get up every 5 minutes, give it a half turn so that it warms up. And then after it gets warm, we're going to move the coals in, and then we'll just be cooking it along just the same way we would cook on a stove. What do we got for questions to start off with?
We don't have any questions in chat, but if anybody has questions, now would be a good time to ask them.
Okay, I am also able to do monologue. Oh, what clay body do you use? Of course, it's a wonderful question. So what I use now is a clay body called Raku. It's from Continental Clay, available out of Continental Clay in Denver or Minneapolis. And its composition is really designed to handle thermal shock, because thermal shock is the bane of our pot's existence. I used to use as well a coarse red earthenware, but I find that the lifespan of the Raku pots is better than the red earthenware ones. The Raku is the whitish color, is rather dull until they've been used. Once they're used, they pick up a nice patina and are very, very, I think, very attractive. Also, adding on to that question, I do a low fire on my cooking pots. Pots that get vitrified or are high fired, like up to cone 6 or cone 10, have, as part of the definition of that vitrification process, a tendency to turn brittle. And they'll work inside of cooking on the fire, but they won't work for as long. Another associated connection there is my cooking pots tend to be a bit thicker than period cooking pots. In period, people had the full understanding of cooking in clay every day. So they didn't have to worry about this learning process. They also didn't carry their pots from place to place, event to event. And so they could be thinner because it's home cooking. When you're out and about going to events, as we do, they need to be more substantial so they survive. Third connection, or another associated topic, is I do both glazed and unglazed pots on the inside. I do not glaze the outside of my pots, just the inside. The big reason is it's easier to clean a glazed pot. And there are glazed, there are people that prefer unglazed. It kind of depends on what you're hoping to recreate. And there we are. Recreate level and your how things need to be. So we're going to sir. Let's take those apples just bubble a bit. And boom.
Austin, your video froze again. You may need to restart it.
Those apples, the liquid, I have a bit of bourbon and a bit of apple cider. Oh, I'm sorry. Ouch, ouch, ouch. It's far less windy today. It's just breeze. So the heat is being far more active. Our barley, where are you? With a spoon, pardon me. I'm probably going to need to add some liquid. Speaking of adding liquid, when you're cooking in clay, the cooking process needs to be concerned with thermal shock as well. We don't want to take cold liquid and pour it in at the edge of the pot. We want to add a bit of liquid in the middle of the pot so that it has a chance to warm before it comes in contact with the side of the pot. There we go. I also have a tendency, as much as possible, to use my hands touching the pot. Part of that reason is I make my heat judgments based off of when things feel warm and when things are too hot to touch. The two pots that I had on in advance are at that too hot to touch phase. So, oh man, pardon me. That fire is hot, hot, hot. Device is overheating. Okay, we're not going to have the device quite so close to the fire anymore. Do we have any other questions yet?
Austin, I was wondering about your fuel source.
Excellent. So, oh, let's see if I can, there we go, get it back to me. So today, I am using charcoal. Pardon me. Believe it or not, like sweating into my eyes. The owners of the house that I'm cooking at
Austin, I think you froze.
my phone overheated. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Fina, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Give me a chat. Can. Okay, there we go. Hi, my phone overheated enough that it decided to reboot. I think we're going to be more careful with getting the phone close to the fire.
I think you got the fire a little hot today.
I think so. You know, it is a very different day. And that is really, okay, we were at fuel sources. So today I'm using charcoal. Charcoal, the reason I'm using charcoal is that it's easy. Readily available, don't have to worry about carrying wood across county lines, all of that sort of stuff. Charcoal works well, wood works well. I've used my clay pots in the oven. I've used my clay pots on a gas grill. Any sort of heat source is a good one. I would not suggest, and actually just don't, use a clay pot on your range top. And point sources are bad. As long as you heat slowly and consistently, it's okay. I had an experience a couple of years ago at Gulf Wars, where I was talking to a young man who was so excited. He got a large cooking pot, and he was so excited about cooking in his cooking pot. And the one thing that I said to him, I said, do not take your cold creation and put it on one of those propane burners that you use for like deep frying turkeys. And I said, don't do that. Don't. So he does it and he breaks his pot. I hear about this from another person. I'm like, as long as he doesn't mind being chastised a bit, I'm going to give him a great discount on a replacement pot. But I do get to chastise a bit because that's the one thing I told him not to do. A propane burner can work, but you have to start slowly to heat it up. I was also going to mention, cooking makes a tremendous amount of difference. If it's cold and damp out versus very still and warm, your fire is going to be different. And so you have to just be cognizant of how your fire is performing. Let's go back and take a look. Again, someday I'm going to have to get an apprentice. That's coming along. Woohoo. And how's this one? Up, we're starting to get some bubbling there. And Mark is now ready to be brought closer to the fire and to have the coals brought around it. And like I said, I'm going to be more careful about not getting the phone too close to the fire. So do we have any other clay people on?
I'm not a potter, but I do cook in clay pots.
Oh, excellent. And where are you from?
Ontier. It's Fina.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So if we notice, our coal pile is getting a little bit depleted because we're moving it around. So we're going to add, and pardon me, I need to set you down for a moment. I'm going to add more coal. To our process. And like use lump charcoal. After I have gotten the fire going, admittedly, I tend to cheat. I tend to use those light the bag briquettes to get the fire started, because that minimizes the amount of chemicals that I add. It's waste because the paint itself is, and it's easier to use. The next step after we get these, the coals against the pot is now we're just going to hang out and chat and go over and stir every once in a while to see progress. A little bit about care and feeding of cooking pots.
Excuse me,
Yep.
before you go there, could you back up just a bit where the standard is warm to the touch versus too hot to touch? Can you, in that context, address size of the pots? Because I notice your apple pots are all the same size. What are the limitations on size for using that standard?
Reasonably speaking, I have used, first of all, that size question. I have used that standard for everything from a 2-cup pipkin up to a 2-gallon extra large pot. The difference there is with a smaller pot with a pipkin, the 2 cup size, I rotate it 180 degrees in the warming process. With a larger pot, I decrease that amount of turn. So let's say with a small cooking pot for me, which is about 1 quart size, I turn that about a third each time in the warming process. With a large cooking pot, which is about 1 gallon, I'll turn that about a quarter of a turn. And with an extra large cooking pot, I'll turn it maybe like a fifth of a turn. And with an extra large, I also try to start off with heat source on like 2 sides, because with an extra large cooking pot, it's going to take too long to get it up to temperature to be able to cook in with just a single heat source. Does that make sense?
It did until you finished the sentence with a single heat source.
Okay, so I use a single heat source, a single mound of coals.
Oh, okay. I thought you were back.
Yep. But with extra large pot, because of the size, I will bank 2 sets of coals. So I'm heating both sides at the same time.
Okay, now I understand.
Okay. And another level of cooking pot gets into when they have legs. And standard cooking pots will have between a 1-inch and 2-inch leg. And those, you can conveniently get the coals a little ways underneath the pot. There are pots that have like 6-inch legs. And very specifically, I do a what I call a Luther pot, because there were pots found in the Martin Luther family plague pit that were found with their lids, which is super rare. And those had good 4 to 6-inch legs. And my assumption is that that's so that you could simmer, because you could be higher above the heat source and have a more controlled simmer. I would like to experiment with hanging pots that hang, and therefore controlling relative heat by the height the pot is away from the fire. And I've just recently found some Jorvik pots that were designed to be hung over a fire. And so hopefully by the time Gulf Wars comes around, probably even Lily's, I will have a few of those pots made, and we'll have tried them to see how that works.
What about trivets?
I do not know of, I haven't researched the use of trivets in period. I would assume that they exist. Small stoves existed that were enclosed on 3 sides, where you'd have a heat source, and then the pot sits in an opening in the top of the stove. There are, I really need to work with an iron worker to know what the use of trivets would look like.
So a couple things
And
from
Fina,
chat.
yep, go ahead.
Mistress Morgana is a potter from Montier. She's with us today. She said she did a series of experiments using different shapes of pots, from small bases to medium to large bases, and she noticed a difference in heating them. She also said her experiments included comparing stoneware, earthenware, and pit-fired cooking pots. And then Tolene asked, for making pots, where is your favorite research, book, place, site, thing?
If you could you repeat that? You were a robot voice for me.
Uh-oh.
For almost all of that. So Morgana did a series of experiments from small to large.
Yes.
And the finding was?
Noticeable difference in heating them. And she also experimented with both stoneware, earthenware, and pit-fired cooking pots.
Makes sense. And and that's part of why I said I do low-fired pots. There are people that do high-fired pots, and I haven't seen a good record of high-fired pots being used. And I think Morgana is very right that, or Morgana or Morgana, I should remember.
Morgana.
Morgana. That we're, this cooking in clay is very, very new to us. The history, is definitely there, but we as modern individuals don't have the day-to-day practice in cooking in clay to be able to know how to do, oh, bugger, excuse me. I'm trying not to get the camera too close. So the ones I started earlier are now boiling right along and smell really good. The rye, or the barley is starting to cook. And our apples are being pretty quiet. So let's bring from Morgana. Fina, what was that comment from Morgana?
She said she used mid-range stoneware cones 5, 6, earthenware cone 4, pit-fired temperature, who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and there's all potters have different ways of coming to what works well for cooking pots. I still have some of the first ones I did were also cone 10 stoneware, because everyone knows that high fire is better than low fire, except for that side that is about the brittleness. And I still have someone who is using one of my first 3 cooking pots that I made, which was a stoneware cone 10 pot. But to the best of my knowledge, that's the only one of probably 6 that are still being used 6 years on.
And also, Tolene asked, for making pots, where is your favorite research place / book / site?
Oh, I will, because I also need to post contact information and a few recipes. I will also put up a list of some of my favorite books. A couple of the favorites, and I unfortunately cannot remember the names, but there's a book about pottery out of Amsterdam. And it goes through by time period and by type of pot, all of a cross section of pots found during archaeological excavation in Amsterdam. And I love that book. I love that book a lot. And yes, Morgana, isn't that just a great book? And there's a couple of books that I really love that are from Jorvik finds. And the thing I love there is they show the pot and then the stamps necessary to produce that pot. So both at Lily's and at Gulf Wars this year, I will have recreated cooking pots that match with the decoration that is appropriate for Jorvik. Lids, no, very few lids have ever been found. So lids, I don't know how perfect they'll be, but I will put on a lid that is what I think is consistent. And as far as my information, I go to the archaeological record. I do not go to the art museum record, because art museums are about the unusual, the unique. The archaeological record and write-ups are about what's found, and reasonably that's day-to-day wares. Yesterday, and going back to that question of clay body, yesterday someone asked, or Friday, someone asked about temper. Temper is the grit that is added to the clay to help it accept thermal shock. Thermal shock is the dramatic movement from cold to hot and hot to cold. Globally, where shell is available, there is a substantial use of shell as the temper in wares, especially in cooking pots. I do not have available commercial ware that's available with shell in it. Once I start with that experimentation, I need to make all the clay myself, and that becomes an awful lot of work. Another reason I should have apprentices. Tostin, that's not polite. Did I get the question accomplished, Fina?
I think so.
Okay. Did we miss anything on the questions?
Tolene says thank you. Okay, and no, we don't have any other current questions at the moment.
Okay. Couple of other types of pots that are available inside of the record. We know that clay skillets existed. We know that drip pans existed. And I mentioned on Friday, drip pans, that I really like the idea of catching the drippings off of roasting meat. And they're designed to sit down at the fire level, and as you rotate the spit around, that the drippings would fall into the pan. And thus gravy is always popular. And frying pans, actually, you can actually fry in them. You can fry bacon, you can saute in them. And there are tagines as well that exist on top of a brazier. And there are a significant number of braziers found across Europe, across time, because it's a convenient way to cook. And pardon me, that arm is falling asleep. And everything really comes back to heating the pots consistently. I have fried bacon in one of my regular cooking pots by slowly warming it dry, tossing in diced bacon and onions, and that is always a great start to any recipe. But the heating has to be a little bit slower and more rotations so that it's consistent all the way around, because you don't have the liquid to help move the heat from the fire level on up. And the person that talked about the tagine, they found that, I think that's what they started doing their clay cooking in. And the brazier has a certain surface area of coals, and the bottom of the tagine is not significantly bigger than the outside of the brazier. So that way it was able to heat the entire bottom. I have had people in braziers put a candle in, and a candle then is a single point of heat, and have ended up cracking the pot because that one spot on the bottom expands and the rest of the pot doesn't, because it's cold. And I come back to the idea of physics always wins. Gravity is not just a highly predictive theory. Gravity works 100% of the time, and pots that fall from a height will tend to become multi-part pots. Thermal action in pottery, when it heats, it expands, is a universal given. And if you have part of the pot expanding and part of the pot not expanding, it's going to become a multi-part pot.
And Tasso, we have just about 5 minutes remaining of the class.
We're finally getting, there we go. The one I found a little bit earlier. See the bubbles in there? That's now bubbling away very nicely. Now, there's something about actually being in practice for all these activities. It has been far too long since we've been able to be together to do these community cooking projects. And the barley and onions and carrots are also coming along nicely. So a little bit of semi-shameless marketing. My website is called pipkinpottery.com, and on there I have a number of recipes and a number of videos, and I will also be posting a set of instructions with basic diagrams of this process of, with your fire a certain distance away, moving it closer, rotating it to be successful. On the cooking side, I've never been a real purist. My thought is, if the items you're using to cook with are period, reasonably speaking, it's a period dish. So any combination of things that you enjoy inside of a clay pot is a great place to start. When I do longer classes that are like pottage classes, we get into the discussion of your base item being a grain. And that you tend to do about a third to a half of the cooking pot in that grain. In the middle, almost 2/3 vegetable. And then you add a little bit of meat, if you're a meat eater, as flavoring. And the best choices of meats are smoked meats. Add flavor that way rather than necessarily overloading the meat side. People of affluent means obviously had more access to meat. Day-to-day people did not. And spices to your taste. At times you have to add a bit more spice than you think you would necessarily have to. Like for these baked apples, once they get to a softer stage, I will, oh yes. Oh, and sausages, oh, I really love using salami. Diced up salami, especially if I heat that a little bit with onions and mushrooms at the bottom, amazing. Uh-oh, my guess is we're almost done.
Just a couple more minutes.
Okay. And, you know, watch the amount of liquid. Liquid will protect you from a lot of sins. Will protect the pot. And, you know, it's always horrible to burn things. Ooh. Other than that, you know, go forth, enjoy cooking in clay. And on the documents that I put up, I'll also put up my contact information. I am more than thrilled to answer any questions. If you belong to a local group that would like to have an exploration of cooking in clay, let me know. We can set something up. I've been lucky enough to do remote sessions to Eldemir, to the East Kingdom, now to the West. So I'm a happy person. I'm more than happy to help out anytime.
Thank you, Tostin, for a wonderful class. Thank you, everyone, for coming and attending. It was wonderful to see all of you at West Coast Culinary Symposium this year.